Are we live?
I think we're live, Nick.
Okay,
yep, you're live, Nick.
Welcome to the panel on philosophy. Yesterday, I mentioned that in the past decade, we have seen the consolidation of a new field of research, the psychedelic humanities, that are beginning to complement the biomedical and psychiatric research on psychedelics. A couple of years ago, I asked in an article whether there was a place for psychedelics in philosophy, and the two speakers we have on this panel today will both answer yes to that question. They represent two different traditions of philosophy, which are often seen as being at odds with each other. So in that respect, they, I think we get a nice pluralist conception of the psychedelic humanities on display here. Dan Oostveen has studied more of a continental philosophy tradition. So he read a lot of Nietzsche and Derrida and Levinas and so on. And he's now associating himself with the school of new materialism, and he works with one of its main proponents, Rosi Braidotti, on a UNESCO project. And Aidan Leon comes from an analytic tradition. What the two share, however, is an interest in Eastern philosophies. So Dan spent some of his teenage years in Indian ashrams, and in 2018, he spent 1 year at the People's University in Beijing to study religious diversity in China. And Aidan has rethought his interest in the philosophy of uncertainty through the lens of Buddhist wisdom. And of course, what they also share is an interest in psychedelics. So the talks today will begin with Dan's. Dan Oostveen is currently a postdoctoral researcher at the Institute for Cultural Inquiry at Utrecht University, where he works on the environmental, biomedical, and post-humanities. And he's also contributing to a UNESCO project on the world humanities. And his talk today will be an argument for a new materialism and a new materialist approach to psychedelic studies. And with this, I'm handing over to, who's first? It's Dan, right? Yeah, Dan is going first.
Yes, I think so. Thank you so much, Nick, for the introduction. Let me check this technology. I think it's working. So yeah, I was 4 years ago at ICPR in Amsterdam as an attendee. And then I was a bit like penning towards these two rooms, towards between the ayahuasca room and the neuropharmacology room. And I was like, okay, everybody's really onto this psychedelics, but it seems that there's like two conversations going on. So I scrambled some notes and then I made it into a talk, and then I went to Prague and presented that. It's 4 years ago, and now we're 4 years ahead, and I hope that my argument is developed, or maybe not. I mean, it's basically I'm still working on the same things. I'm not saying I'm defending it. I'm making maybe a proposal towards just the physical and political way of integrating psychedelic studies, or maybe not even integration, pluralizing. So I think pluralizing is definitely, in a sense, also the right word. I mean, I'm here talking as a philosopher, and a lot of philosophy until now was maybe, okay, we're going to sort of apply some sort of old philosopher on psychedelics, but nobody really cares. Now, I think we should really like sort of look at this psychedelics studies phenomenon, this Renaissance phenomenon, and be critical philosophers when we look at what's going on. And when I look at the presentations here at ICPR, I mean, it's so much different from 4 or 5 years ago. You really see that there's a transdisciplinarity sort of evolving. In the 2016, we talked about the Renaissance, and yesterday it was mentioned a lot that the Renaissance has already been going on maybe since the 90s. But I would say that now, 2020, the Renaissance is fully on. I mean, it's really different. The discourse is really different. The talks which are being held and how the things come in different angles, I think is really different. And we can even see this in this weird sort of online conference, like me talking this COVID situation from Sport. Big money is coming in. Appropriation of psychedelics by cognitive capitalism is, I think, definitely one of the things to consider. We can be very enthusiastic about the Renaissance, about mainstreaming it, but it also means appropriation of cognitive capitalism. And that's I think, really something we have to address. We have to look at the money. Where does the money come from? Where does it go from? Who's poor? Who's rich? Why are they becoming rich? Why are they becoming poor? And these are things we need to address. Okay, well, some of the things I don't really need to repeat to this audience, right? Okay, we see a lot of clinical research going on in the psychedelics realm, great results, great research, beautiful researchers who do things I could never do, like real scientific, serious stuff. And that's being presented here to us and has been presented to us in the former conference. We see this transformation of psychedelics from hard drugs into promising medicine. And we don't even need to explain it. I mean, now we can be serious people, talk about psychedelics. Yeah, that's what we do, you know. It's not a fringe movement anymore. It's not necessarily counterculture anymore. But the pharma funding is pouring in, and that creates its own sort of risk. Philosophically, I would say that the psychedelics ideology, at least 5 years ago, was still very much influenced. We also heard this in the great talk from Nick yesterday, by sort of pitfalls of psychedelics ideology, as I call it. One of them is sort of reversed Orientalism. Things like, oh yeah, it's sort of Eastern wisdom, that's great, or the indigenous wisdom, that's great. And we are with the West, we just have this sort of reductive look on things, so that you get this sort of embrace of the East of the other, sort of reverse Orientalism. That's one of the risks I point out. Second risk, reductive materialism. If you want to reduce everything to sort of brain functions and material stuff, that can also be a risk. Third risk is Neo-Platonism, also the thing which Nick pointed out very well yesterday, that we still want to go to the sort of pluralism of saying, okay, psychedelics touch on the universal core of human experience, and that's what we need to address. But I would argue that also functionalism can be a problem. Also, when we are starting to argue that psychedelics are great because they can do such great things, because they can heal us from PTSD and from depression and anxiety, and if you microdose, you become a better person or a better employee. Like, look what these psychedelics can do. That's all great, and I love it, and I'm not going to contradict it. But there's a risk of making it pure functionalist. On the one hand, there's a risk of making things all too like sort of mystical. On the other hand, there's a risk of making it too functional. Maybe psychedelics have no function at all, and that's also great. And that is definitely a perspective that needs to be on our minds as well. So I also would warn, and many people have said this, against sort of uncritical enthusiasm. That would be one of the other pitfalls. Psychedelics, they the mind. I think the psyche is an old paradigm. Everything with psyche, it still resorts to a sort of soul, a sort of unexplained religious post-concept. And the main question I would like to ask is, how can we get the psyche out of psychedelics? Maybe we need a new word. We know what we're talking about. We know the substances we're talking about. We can describe them. We don't, at least I don't want to reduce them only to their neuropharmacological properties, although that is, of course, legitimate research. But this psyche thing is creating a sort of dualism that we have to be, I think we have to get rid of, because it's nothing. It's not there. It's not material. It doesn't exist. Perennial philosophy, I'm not going into that because this has been repeated a lot, but we have to get rid of this mystical tradition of William James, but also talk the other side of the coin, the non-scientific talk, to always talk about psychedelics in terms of ancient wisdom, gifts from the ancestors, or sort of trans-cultural truth. Those are also risks. They change ourselves also from certain kinds of philosophical critical thinking. The concept of the indigenous takes a forefront here on this conference. I think that's great, because psychedelic studies is one of the psychedelic humanities, as Nick has coined the term. I think it's a great term, Nick, thanks. The indigenous, the psychedelic studies is very avant-garde in taking the indigenous serious, bringing in serious indigenous scholars and seeing, okay, we do have these sort of alternative epistemologies and metaphysical perspectives that we need to take into account. So this is very important. However, there's also a risk, and that's a risk again of reversed Orientalism. Oh, look at this sort of wisdom from the indigenous, and then we're going to bring it into our labs, and then we have a dialogue between West and East, or West and the indigenous, and then we all learn from it. That can be a risk, because it's again overly enthusiastic, and it's Orientalism. So I would say the question which is asked is about health, right? What is health? That is the really philosophical discussion, which should be discussed if you get indigenous scholars and scientists on the table. So the question, what can Western science learn from indigenous wisdom, might not even be the right question, The question is, what is the meaning of health? And we shouldn't only look at this intercultural, right? We should look at this transcultural. Is there a sort of toxification? Is there a sort of detoxification going on? What does this mean, really? And it's not only about posing reductive materialism versus sort of ancient wisdom culture. It's about critically looking at what's really going on. There are certain dualisms still prevalent in psychedelic ideology, and I argue very strongly in favor of a non-dualist psychedelic philosophy, because these dualisms, these sort of Hegelian clashes, these dialectics as well, they are not helping us. They haven't been helping us, and they are continuing to harness serious process. Nature versus culture, technology versus nature. You always have to choose. Do you want to be in the jungle or do you want to be with your technology? New materialism is very strict on this. Donna Haraway says you need to embrace both, and also you cannot be completely devoted to nature nor completely to technology, because it's all part of the same life world. Body versus mind, very strongly, of course. Either we look at it from the outside or from the inside. Either we have the experiential or we have the neuropharmacological. It's always this inside-outside looking trap, which science has to be very careful with. Philosophy has to be very careful with. Illness versus health. Maybe psychedelics don't heal us, and that's also great. Maybe they don't make us sick either, and that's also great. Darkness versus enlightenment. That's still at the background there. East versus West, and science versus spirituality. Why do we have one room where ayahuasca worldviews are being studied, and one room with neuropharmacology? And how can that be a transcultural, not an intercultural, but a transcultural meeting place? That is very important. Let's kill the fathers, Huxley, Hoffman, McKenna, Leary, Shulgins, Groff. Let's embrace the mother, you could say. Of course, we hold them all in high regards, and we wouldn't be here without them, so we embody them, but we should also see how we can go beyond that. So we've seen a few new trajectories in the philosophy of psychedelics. I would like to give some kudos to Nick for coining things like psychedelic humanities and addressing also the thing that psychedelics doesn't only always make us liberal. You also have something like rightist psychedelics. Devino talked about queer psychedelics. Mateo Sanchez is a great talk on him. Go check it out on embodied phenomenology. Of course, you got Sjusted, who always talks about the panpsychism thing. Van der Braak is dealing with non-dualism and ayahuasca as well. So there's a lot of these strands evolving in what you could say this emerging field of psychedelic humanities, and these are just, there's a lot which miss, obviously. New materialism has feminist origins, very important. There's a critical component there, there's an ethical component there, and there's an emphasis on the post-human. It's not about the human brain versus the scientific versus the thing which comes from the outside. It's always an interconnection between technology, mediation, plants, fungi, microorganisms. SARS-CoV-2 is one of them, and they all come together in the psychedelic encounter. And that's very important. We need to make kin. We're making kin with the ayahuasca, with the vine, with the mushrooms, with the LSD, whatever. Some would say, oh, the one thing is maybe synthetic, the other thing is natural, we only need to embrace the natural. The other would say, well, but it's always synthetic and natural. Well, it's all about kin making. These are all our family. It's all family because we share the same earth. We go beyond the nature-culture divide, but new materialism is not only epistemological, it talks from somewhere. The BLM movement matters to stand from. I mean, I'm a white straight man from Amsterdam North, and that's where I'm talking from. I cannot hide that. That's gonna happen. It's a Spinozist worldview. It's about interconnection and multiplicity, not Hegelian. It's not oppositional. It's not we have to kill something or go somewhere else. No, it's always about detoxification. There's an intentionality in psychedelics. They're just not just that matter. So in that sense, the indigenous people, the indigenous epistemology are right. The plant wants to get to us. We don't only want to get to the plant. And that sort of thinking, the Jane Bennett sort of thinking, is important, and we need to take it into account when we emerge into assemblages with plants, with music, with rooms where we find ourselves in, with other people, emphatically. An ethics of care. I mean, the people who do ayahuasca treatment know that is very important. Ethics of care is fundamental. It's about multiplicities instead of oppositions. It's not about dualism, and therefore it's also always about healing. Maybe it's about a sort of continuous healing. But we were never really sick in the first place, and we will never really heal. And that is very important. Again, maybe psychedelics don't serve anything. And that's important because money wants to believe us that we can sell it. That's a product, that we can do something with it. But that can be dangerous. I can go over the keywords, but I don't have that much time. You can all read it later. You've got, of course, Haraway, Anat Singh, Mushroom at the End of the World is one that I highly recommend because there you get all the themes together. Bradotti, of course, Bennett, Povinelli, Karen Barat. You see them all here. So what does this look like? Well, it's an emphasis on the multiple psychedelic encounters, right? There's always an encounter of multiple substances, multiple people, multiple animals, multiple fungi coming together and sharing things, creating a sort of political moment, maybe even an experiential moment if you want to keep the experience in. But we do it together. It's material, it's on the earth, it's in the room, as Matteo said as well. It's very important to get that set and setting from Leary, to get that still around there. In that sense, we don't have to kill all the fathers all the time. Taking into account all the material actors which constitute such an encounter. We're coming together. It's about affectivity. What do you feel? What does your body feel? Not your mind, not your spirit, which flies away, because it's all here. And it's not just the brain. It's very important. It's the embodied things. Not goal-oriented, neither emphasis on sublime unity. We don't want to get something, neither do we want to get enlightened. It's just you embody it when you are in it. Regard for irreducible difference. There is no universal psychedelic experience, and we don't need to want to find it. Continuous intoxication and detoxification. Awareness of the political dimension, which can be subversive, liberation, but it can also be extracting or excluding, as Nick has argued, or emancipating. It can have all these things. In the political dimension, the financial dimension, we have to take them into account. Mainstream of psychedelics is increasing to be the appropriation of them by cognitive capitalism, the money question. Dualistic and dialectic paradigms of healing, universality, West versus East, the indigenous, but also reductive materialism prevent us from properly taking all these political challenges into consideration. New materialism, that's my argument, offers a philosophical framework which takes serious the indigenous approaches to psychedelic. It considers plants and fungi and substances as equal material players in the both affirmative and subversive co-creative interplay of forces. It also offers an answer to the political challenges which are the result of the entering of cognitive capitalism on the stage of psychedelics, an affirmative ethics of kinship, multiple encounters, assemblages of care and embodiment, with the rejection of the human brain as the center of meaning. Thanks for your on the other side of the screens and technology for your most likely attention.
Thank you so much, Dan. We're moving on to the next talk right away because we're pressed for time. So the second talk is by Aidan Leon. He is a philosopher currently at the Institute for Logic, Language and Computation at the University of Amsterdam, but he is also an external member of the Munich Center for Mathematical Philosophy at Ludwig Maximilian University in Munich. His work focuses on the philosophical foundations of uncertainty, and at present it looks at how the psychedelic experience, when properly engaged with, can improve our decision making. Apart from this academic work, he is also the co-founder and CEO of Delphi Cloud, which applies this research to help clients make good decisions in situations of high stakes and extreme uncertainty. And Aidan has a book coming out next year with Oxford University Press titled Psychedelic Experience. And the main thesis of that book is that a psychedelic experience is nothing but a mind-revealing experience, and that such a mind-revealing experience can also occur without the consumption of any substances. And in fact, it can be brought about in an even better way with meditation, better because it's safer, and it's a more reliable way of inducing such experiences. So this relationship between psychedelics and meditation is also the subject matter of Aidan's talk. So, and with this, I hand this over to Aidan.
Hi everyone, today I'm going to tell you about an excerpt of a chapter of my upcoming book, Psychedelic Experience. The chapter is about how we can usefully think about the effects of psychedelics and meditation in terms of attention. To tell you about that chapter, I need to tell you about the first 4 chapters of the book very briefly, because they give the kind of necessary framework for the chapter on attention. Okay, so the key ideas from these 4 chapters are: a psychedelic experience is a mind-revealing experience. In other words, it's an expansion of awareness. The idea is that the mind is a lot like an iceberg. This is a familiar picture that we've all come across before. The tip of the iceberg is just a fraction of what you see. Below the surface lies a whole lot more. And the mind is like that as well. The surface is awareness, and below the surface is the subconscious. Now, we don't have to be committed to any kind of strange theory about the subconscious. We don't have to believe in like Jungian archetypes or what have you. We can just admit that they're like the usual things that are familiar to cognitive psychology. Things like beliefs, memories, ideas, emotions, percepts, desires, and perspectives. And so the idea is that a psychedelic experience is an experience in which some of these things that are like stuck below the surface, it brings them up into awareness. Now, an important point is that it's a hypothesis that so-called psychedelics cause mind-revealing experiences. Although we like to call drugs like psilocybin psychedelics, it's actually a hypothesis that these things actually reveal the mind. Now, that can be an idea that may be unfamiliar to a lot of you because we have the habit of calling these psychedelics, but it really is a hypothesis, and it could be one that is false. This often goes unrecognized, but sometimes it does. For example, in The Entropic Brain Revisited, Robin Carhart-Harris writes, "A principal property of psychedelics is their ability to reveal aspects of the mind that are normally not fully visible. Remarkably, however, that psychedelics do this remains a mere assumption or hypothesis that has never been systematically measured and tested." Now, when we recognize that this is a hypothesis about psychedelic drugs, we see that we can also consider other hypotheses involving psychedelic experience. For example, perhaps meditation causes psychedelic experiences. For each such hypothesis, we need to consider the evidence for it. And if psychedelics and meditation do cause psychedelic experiences, we may learn something valuable by considering their similarities and differences. For example, maybe both expand awareness via similar but different effects on attention. And this gets us to the main talk for today. Okay, so why should we be interested in attention? Well, we're interested in psychedelics, obviously. And we're also interested in meditation. And the reason why is because we think that both of these things cause psychedelic experiences. And what that means is that they both have a positive effect on awareness. That is, psychedelics expand awareness and meditation expands awareness. Where does attention come into this? Well, it turns out there's an interesting relationship between attention and awareness, which I'm going to explain. And we know that there's a positive relationship between meditation and attention. So given that, it seems reasonable to expect that there'd be a positive relationship between psychedelics and attention. However, the little research that we have on psychedelics and attention shows that there's a negative relationship, that psychedelics impair attention. So that creates a bit of a puzzle for us. Does that mean that psychedelics are going to have a positive effect on awareness by some other means? Or is this relationship here a little bit more complicated than what meets the eye? I'm going to argue that the latter is the case, that the story here is a little bit more complicated. And in fact, while there is that negative relationship, there's also a positive relationship between psychedelics and attention. Okay, so now let's look at the relationship between attention and awareness. Many of us are already familiar with the idea that when something is already in awareness, then if we attend to it, we can see it better. However, attention also helps put things into awareness that weren't there already in the first place. We can see this in the following kind of example. This is the GABA patch. I'm going to present it in one of these two circles. If I present it faintly enough and quickly enough, there's a good chance you won't see it, like this. Okay, did you see it? Maybe you did, maybe you didn't. If you didn't, then it would be easier for you to see it if I cued your attention by dimming one of the circles and warning you where the GABA patch is going to appear. Okay, so now you know where it's going to appear. It's probably easier for you to see it. Okay, now the reason for this is because without that cue, your attention is dispersed evenly or roughly evenly across the scene. And when we cue your attention, it focuses on that circle. And the reason for this is that because I'm presenting the stimulus with so quickly and so faintly, the signal is very weak. There is an amplification due to attention, but it's not enough to get it through that threshold of awareness. And what happens when I cue your attention is that your attention concentrates over that circle, and that draws your attention from other areas of the scene and piles it up onto this area where the GABA patch is being presented. And that extra amplification brings the percept up through the threshold of awareness. Okay, now here's a weird thing. Normally when we do this sort of thing, we have that initial starting point where we have two empty circles. We cue your attention, we briefly present the stimulus, we go back to the starting point, and then we ask you what you saw. Now the cue makes it more likely that you see the stimulus. What's kind of mind-blowing is that this is still true even if we present the cue after the stimulus. This was discovered in a study by Sargent et al. In 2013 called Cueing Attention After the Stimulus is Gone Can Retrospectively Trigger Conscious Perception. So what we're seeing in this kind of situation is that even though the stimulus is gone, by focusing your attention to where the stimulus was, it amplifies you can think of it as like an echo in your mind of the stimulus. It's lurking around in the subconscious, doesn't appear in awareness, but if we concentrate your attention, that can amplify it and bring it into awareness. That relationship between attention and awareness is the key idea of this talk. Meditation and psychedelics can have this kind of effect on attention and thereby bring things into awareness that would otherwise have remained in the subconscious. Okay, so now we've seen the relationship between attention and awareness. We're now going to look at the right-hand side of the triangle and focus on the relationship between meditation and attention. Specifically, we're going to look at how meditation can improve attention. Okay, so there are many forms of meditation, but because time is limited, I'm just going to talk about one. It's called focused attention meditation. And here's the kind of instruction you would get for this form of meditation. Focus your attention on something. For example, this could be your breath. When you notice your attention drift, gently return it back to your point of focus. And then keep doing that for as long as you can. This form of meditation encourages a focused state of attention. If we think back to the diagrams that we just used for the GABA patches, we can think of it like this. Focused attention meditation moves you from a diffused state to a focused state. The point of focus could be anything. Typically, it's your breath. Now, when you fail at this, which inevitably you will, you'll find that your attention focuses on all sorts of things. It could be your to-do list, an argument you had, you worry about your finances, or something like this. When you notice that, the task is to move your attention away from those items and back to the single point of focus, for example, your breath. This form of meditation develops an awareness of your distribution of attention and its dynamics. You become aware of how you're spending your attentional resource. It creates a stability of the distribution of attention. Because you become more practiced at focusing your attention on a particular point, you get better at holding it in a particular way. And you get more flexible control over the distribution of attention. You learn how to disengage from your to-do list or whatever and bring it back to your breath. Okay, now in our triangle, you can think of this as the green arrow. Meditation improves attention. Now let's see how meditation affects awareness via this effect on attention. One easy way to see this is in terms of attentional blink. Here's an example of how that works. I'm going to present you a stream of letters in this image here on the left where we've got the black cross. Your task is to tap your finger if you see a B, and then tap your finger if you see an X. Here's the stream. Okay, did you see the X? It's okay if you didn't. It's actually common for people not to notice the X, especially when it occurs soon after the B. Why? This is because noticing the B, it captures a lot of your attentional resource. In a way, you kind of get excited to see the B. And then it's difficult for you to reallocate your attention back to the watchful state so that you can notice the X. It is as though your attention blinks, and hence the name. Okay, so why is attentional blink relevant? Well, studies have shown that meditation reduces attentional blink. Meditation makes it easier for you to see that X that's coming soon after the B. The explanation is that meditation makes it easier for you to reallocate your attention after it's been captured by the B. We can think of this as an example of meditation causing a psychedelic experience. Normally, the X is subliminal, and meditation helps lift it out of the subconscious so that it appears in awareness. Okay, so we've seen the right-hand side of the triangle now. We've seen how meditation has a positive effect on attention, and as a result, expands awareness. Now let's look at the left-hand side of the triangle, psychedelics. If everything was neat and tidy, we would expect to see a green arrow here, a positive relationship between psychedelics and attention, like the one between meditation and attention. However, the research that we have shows that there's a negative relationship. Psychedelics impair attention. That creates a bit of a puzzle. Is that the full story? Or does that mean that the effect that psychedelics have on awareness happens by some other means? I think the answer is the story is not so simple. There is actually a positive relationship between psychedelics and attention. So here's the solution to the puzzle. An impairment of attention is an impairment of the control over how attentional resource is allocated. And psychedelics do seem to impair attention this way. There are several studies that show this now. However, psychedelics may nevertheless have a different kind of positive effect on attention. So here's an hypothesis I want to propose. Psychedelics increase attention. And what I mean by this is that they increase the amount of attentional resource that is available for allocation. Okay, we can make this a little bit clearer by looking at those diagrams that we saw about the GABA patches. During normal experience, you've got that level of activation due to the stimulus input, and then you've got a level of extra activation due to the amplification due to attention. And normally that's not enough to get that GABA patch up into awareness. Now, when we focus attention, either due to a cue or even due to focused attention meditation, we can get the GABA patch up into the threshold of awareness. Now, the idea that I'm proposing is that psychedelics are like the normal situation during normal experience, but there's an extra amount of attentional resource that we have that can lift anything up into awareness, including that GABA patch. The idea is that psychedelics gives us an extra amount of attentional resource that we can use to amplify things. Meditation makes compromises. It can boost it in some places, and then it has to reduce it in other places. Psychedelics can increase it across the board. All right, so a natural question to ask at this point is, where does that extra attentional resource come from? In the diagram I've given you, the distribution of attention I've been presenting is, roughly speaking, across the visual scene. But that distribution continues. You've got other things going on in your mind besides your visual scene. You've got your memories, emotions, thoughts for the future, desires, and so on. So you've got attention being allocated to other areas of the mind. So the thought is that maybe what psychedelics do is that they disrupt the usual allocation of attentional resource all throughout the mind and kind of free it up and allow it to flow more freely throughout the mind. We know, for example, that attention is used to inhibit elements of the mind. So far in this talk, I've been focused on the kind of amplificatory nature of attention, that it like brings things into awareness. But we also know that attention functions to keep things out of awareness. There's an inhibitory aspect to attention. And we know that there's always a lot of task-free cognition going on. This is the sort of cognition that's associated with the default mode network, which is a huge consumer of cognitive resource. So the thought is that maybe what's going on with psychedelics is that they reduce the amount of attentional resources being devoted to these areas of cognition, and thereby free up the amount of attentional resource that can flow into other areas. And in this case, it would be flowing into the visual scene. So by disrupting the usual patterns of attentional resource allocation, psychedelics cause a kind of freeing up of attentional resource. And this fits well with what we observe at the neural level. Disruptions of the default mode network, the salience network, increases in entropy, and so on. We also have evidence for this idea that comes from what we might call the phenomenological perspective of psychedelics. So here's an example. We know that focusing attention causes a local increase in apparent saturation of colors. This comes from a seminal study by Fuller and Carrasco in 2006. Given that result, then if psychedelics increase available attention across the board, then we should expect that they tend to cause a global increase in apparent saturation. And of course, this is a very common report about psychedelics. They make colors pop, they make them more saturated and vibrant and so on. For example, in his 1956 essay, Heaven and Hell, Huxley writes, all colors are intensified to a pitch far beyond anything seen in a normal state. So given what we know about independently about saturation and attention, this fits well with the phenomenological common reports that we see of psychedelics. Okay, so we've now seen the left-hand side of the triangle. Although it's true that psychedelics impair attention, it's entirely possible that they increase attention. That is, they increase the amount of available attentional resource. If that's correct, then we can say that psychedelics expand awareness by increasing attention. Putting all that together, we have the completion of our beautiful triangle. We have a unified account of the psychedelic experiences that are created by psychedelics and meditation via their effects of attention. Okay, to wrap things up, psychedelics and meditation may expand awareness via similar but different effects on attention. Their similarity is elements of the subconscious receive more attention than they otherwise would. The difference is meditation does this by skillfully shifting attention to elements of the subconscious. And psychedelics do this by freeing up attentional resource and allowing it to flow onto elements in the subconscious. If there's one idea you take away from this talk, it's this. Attention, psychedelics, and meditation, same, but different. Okay, thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Aidan. Thank you, Aidan. I think we're back with the audience. So we have about 10 minutes for Q&A. If you have questions, please post them in the Zoom chat. And since I haven't seen any so far, I'll ask one to kick off the discussion myself. So Aidan's talk represents a style of philosophy that very much builds on empirical findings. And I was wondering how that relates to the new materialism that Dan is proposing. Basically, you know, what I'm wondering about is you have a metaphysical framework like the new materialism, and then how exactly does that relate to empirical findings? Is it supported by empirical findings? Is it a contingent conceptual framework through which you can interpret findings differently, maybe differently from the way in which Aidan interpreted them? Or would it require to do science differently? Would a new materialist science take a different form from the kind of neuroscientific work that we currently see?
Nick, my camera is, I think, still off, and I'm not, myself, I'm not allowed to put it back on.
Can I do that?
Oh, the host has asked to start your camera. Yeah, but I start my video. Yes, there we go again. Do you want me first or Aidan first?
Well, the question is directed more directly to you, so you should probably.
So, I mean, what is very important to say maybe about the new materialist frameworks when it comes to sort of empirical research and the process is that it doesn't necessarily contradict it. I mean, like I said, a lot of empirical research is great stuff. But what I do warn about, obviously, with the new materialist approach, is that certain ideas and thoughts and conceptions are still present when we do science, although we assume that we do objective stuff, right? We want to get rid of the sort of stigma of psychedelics being drugs or whatever. And so then we do like the sort of hard science, and then we think that we're sort of clean or clear of out of the blue. And I think that's wrong. I mean, the whole field of psychology assumes a sort of psyche, which is a soul, etc. And I say, well, that is necessarily a result of a sort of post-Christian sort of worldview. So science is just not free there. And it's the same in the end. It's the same in physics. So the whole thing is that epistemology and even doing empirical research is just not politically neutral. That doesn't necessarily, I mean, it's not necessarily a different frame to reframe the results, but it's really about, like Foucault says, that if you ask an empirical question, that question has an implication for the world, and it has an implication, as Deleuze would say, for how the money will flow and who funds you and why do they fund you and why do you ask that empirical question. So the sort of methodology of what you're doing would be very different. I'm not sure if with that I answered to complete your question.
How would it be different?
Well, now there is an idea that you have the sort of humanities as opposed to the sciences, and that the sciences do like scientific research, which is sort of neutral and objective, and etc. etc. And the humanities, they're like about Geist sort of things, psyche sort of things. So what I do also with my research in the new humanities is showing that your scientific research is never neutral, which, by the way, good scientists know that as well, so that you get in all these preconditions. Because what you now often see is that scientists then in the end of their talk say something about, yeah, we should all be like humans and peaceful or something. So you get this really A-grade sort of worldview answers. So whatever you do empirical, you should legitimize by using also sort of advanced humanistic analysis or post-humanistic analysis. That's how it should be different. So why do you do what you do? And don't give me a simple answer about, yeah, it's so great, we're going to be healthy. That's not enough for me.
Aidan, do you want to jump in?
Well, so I guess the way I think about it is psychedelics open up a kind of sort of an interesting way of taking us from what you might think of the safety of empirical research, the things that we can measure and can kind of define by convention. And they take us into these more uncertain and challenging areas, such as like areas of mystical experience and the kind of practical or sociological value of psychedelics. And one of the challenges with this is that there's a tendency to sort of dive into the deep end, that the stuff about mystical experience and, you know, revolutionizing society and technology and everything like that, it's really exciting. We want to jump into that. But there are a lot of people who are not ready to jump into that deep end with us. And there needs to be some kind of connection with what's familiar and measurable to these more kind of challenging or paradigm challenging ideas. And so what I'm trying to do with my work is connect those two things. Take us on a slow journey from measuring things like attention and memory and visual perception, and then get us to, in a kind of scientific or rigorous way, to these more challenging ideas.
So yeah, go ahead.
May I ask a question to Aidan to get the interaction going? I think your talk is great, and I think you did a really good way in analyzing what you're doing. When you start with analyzing meditation and psychedelics and the sort of results they affect, then my critical question would of course be like, why does it really matter if it's the same? Like, obviously taking a psychedelic is different in itself already from sitting still. And I would say that difference is fine. And if I can even agree with an argument that says, well, it's basically elicits the same sort of experiences, but then it doesn't take away that it's still different and that I can still say, well, I just eat shrooms because I want to eat shrooms, right? Does it really matter is my question.
It depends what your purpose is. So one of my goals is to learn about these experiences as much as possible. So finding different ways of causing them, gives you the opportunity to learn new things by looking at those similarities and differences. But I think one of the interesting differences between meditation and psychedelics is that meditation is this gradual thing that requires a lot of discipline and a sustained practice. Whereas taking psychedelics, you can do it right now. It can happen very quickly, and within an hour, you're going to have some pretty challenging experiences. But you don't get the discipline or the sort of kind of practices for integrating the lessons learned during that experience into your daily life that comes along with meditation. Now, there's actually some research that shows that you do get, to some degree, there's research that shows that psychedelics increase mindfulness up to about 16 months after the session, I think, but not to the same degree as a sustained practice of meditation. So I think these things have pros and cons, like that you can think of them as two different tools. And actually probably the most useful thing is combining them in some intelligent way. So you get the best of both worlds.
So I have one question from the audience, primarily for Aidan, which is, so you are saying that you're talking about freeing up attentional resources. And the question is, do you suggest that the brain can focus more on vibrancy of color, etc., under the influence of psychedelic compounds, as it automatically focuses less on the shopping list, the argument with the spouse, and so on? If the brain could be completely quiet of these things, would you suggest that the effects on attention would be almost psychedelic in nature? And you have 3 minutes maximum to answer.
Okay, it's a great question. So one of the issues with psychedelic trips is that we all know that they vary. There's such a great variation in what can happen. Sometimes it can be a very peaceful experience and colors are saturated and everything looks great. And sometimes it can be a nightmare of anxiety and trauma, and all you're doing is focused on the problems of your life. So the idea is that if these psychedelics free up the usual patterns of attentional resource, but where that attention goes is highly variable, and it can matter on all sorts of things like your initial intentions, your the mental state going into the trip, your context, and your setting. So for a given trip, it's hard to tell where the attentional resource is going, but for sort of small or medium doses of psychedelics in pretty regular calm situations, you could kind of make the rough prediction that it's going to go fairly evenly across the mind. So it's going to bring up memories and emotions and things like this, but also into the visual scene, and increase the apparent saturation of what you're seeing, also the apparent contrast and brightness and so on.
Dan, you want to add anything?
No, not on this topic. No, I just want to
point
out this. Yeah, no, sorry. Go on.
So we have 1 minute left, so I think we can take another question. What I suggest is we reconvene in the after talk room. So I created an after talk philosophy room.
Nick, there's a lot coming in the Q&A. You should also have a look at that. There's about 7 questions there. Maybe you.
I know, but we no longer have time to discuss in this space.
No, we'll do that in the after room.
Exactly. So we go to the after room. Maximum 30 people can join, and we'll discuss there. Okay. So
social distance, maximum 30.
You go to community in the Wova app and click on the after talk philosophy link. See you in a second.
Thanks,
bye.
Everybody.
Thank you so much for the
Thanks,
great
everyone.
talks. This was a great panel. Thank you.
Thanks.